The quiet suburban street had always worn the illusion of peace like a well-pressed uniform. Rows of identical houses stood in neat lines, trimmed lawns shining under the careful hands of hired gardeners, and freshly painted mailboxes giving the impression that everything was under control. To anyone passing by, it looked like the perfect place to build a life. But beneath the surface of this planned perfection lay something far more rigid and far less forgiving. The neighborhood was ruled not by kindness or community, but by a powerful homeowners association that believed order mattered more than people. The HOA governed every detail, from the color of curtains that faced the street to the height of the grass that framed each driveway. They claimed it was about preserving property value, but for many residents, it felt like living under constant surveillance. Cameras sat quietly on street corners. Notices appeared on doors without warning. Fines were handed out as easily as smiles were withheld. Fear was the unspoken language of the neighborhood, and everyone had learned to speak it fluently. In the middle of this pristine suburb lived a man who seemed to exist outside the invisible social hierarchy. His house was modest compared to the others, a simple structure with a garage that held more than just a car. He kept to himself, rarely attending community gatherings or HOA meetings, and that made him an easy target. To the board members who thrived on control, anyone who did not actively participate in their system was suspicious. The man had moved into the neighborhood quietly. There were no grand introductions, no welcoming party. He simply arrived, parked his vehicle, and began living his life. That alone was enough to make the HOA uneasy. They were used to knowing everything about everyone, from job titles to vacation schedules. Not knowing him was like a loose thread in a perfectly woven fabric, and it bothered them deeply. Whispers began to circulate. Some said his garage was cluttered. Others claimed he was storing items that violated HOA codes. No one knew for sure, but rumors had a way of becoming truth in places like this. The HOA board, always eager to assert its authority, decided it was time to take action. They justified it as routine enforcement, but in reality, it was fueled by curiosity and a hunger for control. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and cast long shadows across the driveways, two HOA guards pulled up in front of the man's house. They wore uniforms that looked official enough to make people nervous, though they were not law enforcement. Their job was to enforce HOA rules, but they often behaved as if they were far more powerful than that. They walked up the driveway with a sense of entitlement, already convinced that they would find something to justify their intrusion. The garage door was closed, hiding whatever lay inside. To the guards, it was an invitation. They believed that the HOA's authority gave them the right to inspect anything they suspected of being out of compliance. Without hesitation, they prepared to enter. To them, this was not someone's private property. It was just another space to be controlled. Inside the house, the man felt a strange unease. He had grown accustomed to being watched, but this felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something important was about to happen. Still, he remained calm. He had lived through far worse than nosy HOA guards, and he trusted that the truth would eventually reveal itself. The garage door began to rise, its mechanical hum echoing down the street. Neighbors peeked through their windows, pretending not to watch while absorbing every detail. Moments like these were the closest thing the community had to drama, and it fed their curiosity like fire to dry grass. Everyone assumed the man was in trouble. That was how these stories usually went. As the door lifted higher, the guards prepared themselves to take notes, to snap photos, to issue fines. They expected to find chaos, maybe some minor violation they could use to assert their dominance. What they did not expect was the stillness that greeted them. The garage was not messy or neglected. It was organized, clean, and filled with items that told a story far larger than any HOA rulebook could capture. There were boxes labeled with care, tools arranged with precision, and documents stored in protective cases. It was not the garage of someone who did not care. It was the garage of someone who valued what he owned. The guards paused, unsettled by how wrong their assumptions had been. But they pressed on, determined to find something, anything, that would justify their presence. As they moved deeper into the garage, they noticed a large, secured cabinet. It stood out, not because it was forbidden, but because it looked important. The guards exchanged glances, their curiosity growing. In their minds, this had to be where the violation was hidden. Something about it made them feel both excited and uneasy. They approached it, unaware that they were about to cross a line far greater than any painted boundary or HOA regulation. Inside that cabinet lay proof, not of wrongdoing, but of a truth that would shatter everything they believed about the man they had so casually targeted. The neighborhood, still watching in silent anticipation, had no idea that the balance of power was about to shift. What started as a routine HOA inspection was about to become a revelation that would expose the arrogance of authority and the strength of someone who had been underestimated as the guards reached for the cabinet. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath. The man inside the house waited as well, not with fear, but with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. The illusion of HOA control was about to crack, and once it did, nothing in the neighborhood would ever be the same again. The first chapter closes here, just before the guards uncover the truth inside the garage, setting the stage for the dramatic revelation to come. The moment the secured cabinet in the garage came into full view, something shifted in the air. The HOA guards, who had entered the property with smug certainty, now moved with a cautious curiosity they did not want to admit. Their authority had always rested on the assumption that the people they policed were smaller than them, weaker than them, easier to control. Yet the neatness of the garage and the quiet dignity of the space unsettled that assumption. It felt less like a place hiding violations and more like a vault holding something of importance. They proceeded anyway, driven by the same arrogance that had ruled the neighborhood for years. Their hands, gloved and official-looking, reached for the cabinet as though it were already theirs to inspect. Papers were pulled out, folders flipped through, and suddenly the atmosphere changed again, this time in a way that could not be undone. Inside were not illegal items or HOA code violations, but deeds, legal filings, and sealed envelopes bearing the markings of property offices and law firms. The guards did not fully understand what they were seeing at first. They only knew it did not look like anything belonging to a careless or powerless homeowner. As they scanned the pages, their expressions hardened into confusion, then into something closer to alarm. The documents did not list the man as merely a resident. They listed him as something far more significant. The ownership records were unmistakable. The land beneath not just his home, but large portions of the entire neighborhood, was traced back to him. The neat houses, the manicured lawns, the pristine sidewalks, all sat on property that, by legal definition, was still under his control. The HOA, the very body that claimed to rule the community, existed only because of contracts and agreements that ultimately flowed through his name. What the guards had thought was a forgotten homeowner was, in reality, the foundation upon which the entire neighborhood had been built. Outside, neighbors continued to peer through blinds and curtains, expecting to witness another resident being fined or humiliated. Instead, they were about to witness something far more unsettling: the collapse of a narrative they had believed in for years. The HOA guards, once so confident, now stood in a garage that suddenly felt too small to contain the weight of what they had uncovered. The man stepped into the garage then, not with anger or raised voice, but with a quiet presence that commanded attention. He had allowed the inspection to continue, not out of weakness, but out of patience. He knew that the truth, once seen, could no longer be denied. The guards, now painfully aware of what they had done, could no longer look at him as just another resident. For years, he had chosen to live simply, quietly, letting the HOA believe it held all the power. He had watched as they fined widows for minor yard violations, harassed families over trivial rules, and treated people like problems instead of neighbors. He had endured their scrutiny without protest, not because he was powerless, but because he believed that sometimes the most powerful response was to wait until the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived. The guards felt the shift immediately. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now felt like costumes. The rules they enforced suddenly seemed small and hollow compared to the legal reality unfolding before them. The garage, which had been opened in an attempt to assert dominance, had become a stage for their own humiliation. Word began to spread. One neighbor whispered to another. Phones were lifted. Messages were sent. The story that was forming was not about a man being punished by the HOA, but about an HOA that had unknowingly tried to punish the very person who held its fate in his hands. the man did not need to speak. His presence, combined with the documents laid bare in the garage, told a story more powerful than any confrontation could. It was the story of a person who had been underestimated, of quiet strength that had been mistaken for weakness, and of authority that had grown arrogant enough to forget its own limits. The HOA guards, now fully aware of their mistake, began to retreat in spirit even as they remained physically in place. Their earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a dawning fear of consequences. They had not just trespassed, they had challenged someone who legally owned far more than they had ever imagined. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear of HOA fines and warnings, was beginning to feel something new. The thrill of watching power finally being held accountable. This revelation did not just affect the guards. It sent shockwaves through the entire community. The HOA board, which had built its identity on control, was about to face a reckoning. The man they had dismissed as insignificant was, in truth, the silent architect of their authority. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the street, the illusion of HOA dominance continued to crumble. The garage door remained open, a symbolic wound in the facade of order the HOA had worked so hard to maintain. Inside, the truth waited patiently, unmovable and undeniable. And with that truth now exposed, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force the entire neighborhood to reevaluate who truly held the power and what justice would look like when it finally arrived. The second chapter ends here, as the revelation of ownership begins to spread, setting the scene for the HOA's inevitable reckoning in the next chapter. By the following morning, the neighborhood no longer felt like the orderly paradise it once pretended to be. Something invisible yet powerful had shifted, and everyone could sense it. The revelation from the garage had traveled faster than any official notice ever had. What had been discovered behind that quiet man's closed doors was now the unspoken truth hanging over every manicured lawn and spotless driveway. The HOA board members gathered in hurried secrecy, their usual confidence replaced by nervous urgency. They had built their authority on the belief that the community belonged to them, that their rules were the highest law within those borders. Now they were forced to confront a reality that shattered that illusion. The very land they governed had never truly been theirs to control. For years, they had enforced their codes with ruthless precision. Families had been fined for leaving toys in their yards. Elderly residents had been warned for faded paint. People had been pressured into compliance, not because the rules were fair, but because resistance seemed futile. The HOA had cultivated a culture where fear was more effective than respect. The man at the center of it all had seen every one of those injustices. He had chosen not to intervene immediately, watching how power, when left unchecked, slowly turned into cruelty. He had lived among them not as a ruler, but as a quiet observer, waiting for the moment when the truth would matter most. That moment had arrived the instant the HOA guards opened his garage. Now, the same board members who had once ignored his existence were scrambling to protect themselves. Legal documents were reviewed, contracts re-examined, and meetings called behind closed doors. They realized, with growing dread, that their authority had always depended on his ownership. Without it, they were nothing more than a group of people pretending to have control. Meanwhile, the man continued his routine as calmly as ever. He walked his street, nodded to neighbors, and carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the way people looked at him had changed. Eyes that once passed over him now lingered with curiosity, respect, and even gratitude. For the first time, many residents saw him not as a quiet outsider, but as someone who might finally bring justice to a community that had long been ruled by intimidation. Stories began to surface. One family spoke of being fined when they could barely afford groceries. Another remembered how they had been threatened for planting flowers without approval. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns of abuse hidden beneath the HOA's polished image. And now, for the first time, those stories had somewhere to go. The man listened to them all. He absorbed their pain, their anger, their exhaustion. His ownership of the land was not just a legal technicality. It was a responsibility he had never taken lightly. He had inherited that responsibility through years of careful planning and quiet investment. But more importantly, he felt it through the people who lived on that land. The HOA board could feel the ground slipping beneath their feet. Their power, once unquestioned, was now being scrutinized by the very residents they had controlled. The guards who had raided the garage became symbols of the board's overreach, their uniforms no longer inspiring fear but ridicule. The man's silence, once mistaken for weakness, now felt like a storm gathering strength. Everyone knew something was coming. The only question was how far the truth would reach and how deeply it would cut. Legal experts began to take interest. Community advocates started asking questions. The HOA, which had always operated in the shadows of complexity and fine print, was being dragged into the light. Contracts that had never been challenged were suddenly being read carefully. Clauses that favored the HOA were being reinterpreted in the context of the man's undeniable ownership, and the deeper people looked, the more cracks they found. The HOA had not just enforced rules, it had abused them. It had not just maintained property values, it had eroded trust. The neighborhood, once united only by shared fear, was now finding a sense of solidarity it had never known before. Through it all, the man remained steady. He did not seek revenge for the way he had been treated. He sought something far more powerful: fairness. His goal was not to destroy the HOA, but to remind it that authority without compassion was hollow. The board members, however, were beginning to realize that their survival depended on more than excuses. They faced not just legal consequences, but the moral weight of their actions. The community was watching, and it was no longer willing to look away as tension built. The neighborhood prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. The truth had been revealed, and once truth takes root, it cannot be easily removed. The quiet man who had once been overlooked was now the center of attention, not because he demanded it, but because justice had finally found a voice through him. The third chapter closes as the HOA's authority hangs by a thread, with the final outcome about to be decided. By the time the final reckoning arrived, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place ruled by fear. It felt like a place standing on the edge of awakening. What had begun as a quiet inspection of a garage had turned into a revelation that stripped away years of unchecked authority. The HOA board, once so powerful in their carefully maintained offices and polished meeting rooms, now faced a community that no longer believed in their manufactured dominance. The man who had lived quietly among them stood at the center of it all, not with raised fists or angry demands, but with the unshakable certainty of someone who knew the truth. His ownership of the land was no longer a secret. It had been verified, reviewed, and recognized by those who mattered. The HOA's entire structure rested on agreements that had been written to serve the community, not to enslave it. And those agreements had been abused. As legal scrutiny intensified, the HOA's authority began to crumble. Fines that had once been issued without question were suddenly being challenged. Notices that once carried fear now felt hollow. The board members, who had used rules as weapons, were now forced to confront the reality that they had never truly owned the power they claimed. Residents who had once kept their heads down began to stand taller. They shared stories of how the HOA had made them feel small, how it had punished them for being human. Gardens that had been removed for being unapproved were remembered. Homes that had been threatened over trivial details were not forgotten. The pain that had been buried under compliance was finally allowed to surface. The man listened, not as a ruler, but as a steward. He had not revealed his ownership to dominate the neighborhood, but to protect it. The land was not just an investment to him. It was a community, a living tapestry of families, dreams, and struggles. He believed that a place where people lived should be governed by fairness, not fear. The HOA board, cornered by truth and public pressure, attempted to defend itself. They spoke of procedures and regulations, of tradition and control, but their words rang empty against the lived experiences of the residents. The community had seen behind the curtain, and what they found there was not order, but exploitation. One by one, the systems that had upheld the HOA's grip began to fail. Legal challenges moved forward. Contracts were rewritten. Oversight replaced secrecy. The board members who had once acted with impunity were forced to answer for their actions. Some stepped down. Others faced consequences that extended far beyond embarrassment. Through it all, the man remained calm, steady, and unwavering. He did not celebrate the downfall of those who had wronged him. He focused instead on what could be built in its place. His vision for the neighborhood was not one of chaos, but of balance. Rules could exist, but they should serve the people, not control them. Authority could be necessary, but it must always be rooted in respect. Slowly, the neighborhood began to change. Meetings became open and transparent. Residents had a voice where once they had only silence. Decisions were made with empathy instead of arrogance. The fear that had once defined the community gave way to a cautious but growing trust. The garage that had started it all was no longer just a storage space. It had become a symbol. It represented the truth hidden behind assumptions, the power of quiet strength, and the way justice can emerge from the most unexpected places. The man who had been targeted by the HOA guards returned to his simple life, not because he lacked power, but because he no longer needed to prove it. His presence in the neighborhood now carried a different weight. He was not feared, but respected, not because he owned the land, but because he had chosen to use that ownership to protect those who lived on it. In the end, the greatest lesson was not about property or legal rights. It was about the danger of authority without accountability and the quiet power of integrity. The HOA had believed it controlled everything, but it had forgotten the most important truth of all, that real power belongs to those who choose to use it with fairness and compassion. As the sun set over the once oppressive suburb, its light now felt warmer, less harsh. Children played without fear of violating some hidden rule. Neighbors spoke to one another with new openness. And in the middle of it all stood a man who had waited patiently for the right moment to let justice speak. What had begun as a raid on a garage had ended as a transformation of an entire community. The illusion of control had been replaced by something far stronger, a shared understanding that no rule, no board, and no uniform could ever outweigh the value of human dignity. And with that, the story of the quiet homeowner and the fallen HOA came to its close, leaving behind a neighborhood that finally belonged to the people who lived there.